Good morning. I want to build further on some of the themes you've heard already, and I want to start by talking about the crisis of connection, and just point out that if you're paying attention to what's happening in the world, it's easy to see that crisis because it shows up every day in response to some of our most pressing problems. If you think about the war in Syria, a war that has taken the lives of thousands of people in just the last 4 years, displaced millions, and now spreading into other parts of the Middle East. If you think about the global warming and the fact that increasingly those of us who live in places that are not immediately affected can somehow cut ourselves off as though it doesn't exist or be in deep denial or something that we could put off to address at some point in the future. Or if you think about the responses to the police killings that have occurred in the country, whether they be in Ferguson or Staten Island, if you're not directly affected, it can seem like someone else's problem. And that, I think, recreates and reinforces this crisis of connection, a crisis of empathy. I was listening to an American Buddhist talk about this crisis of empathy, and he says that we are faced with so much suffering in the world that we have no ability to process it. So after a while, we numb ourselves to it so that we come to accept suffering as normal. We see the homeless person in the street in the cold, and we walk by because were we to stop, we wouldn't know how to respond, so it's easier to just walk by and accept it. And these crises in connection, in empathy, I think reinforce the dehumanization that Niobe and Carol have spoken about. And it leads us to look at the other, whether the other be in another part of the world or right around us, as someone who is different, who is not part of us, who is in some way less human, and in the process undermines our own sense of our humanity. So the question that we've been asking through Patch is, how do we counter this feeling of being overwhelmed by suffering, the hopelessness and the paralysis that sets in when you don't know what to do about these enormous issues that are facing us? Feelings that I think are quite natural, but avoidable. And the way that it be avoided is by simple acts. And I'm going to point out some. I'm going to start with the Ebola crisis. Some of you remember that just back as recently as September, we were told that Ebola was going to become a pandemic that would spread across the world in a few weeks and infect more than 1 million people. A few months later, Ebola is largely abated. And that happened largely because of efforts by people like this doctor sitting in the middle of that picture, Masoka Fala, who said that the key to countering Ebola was to build trust in the community. He was from the West Point neighborhood in Monrovia, trained at Harvard as an epidemiologist, and went back to his country at a time when others were fleeing. And he said the way to organize the people is to teach them how to deal with the bodies and teach them not to be afraid and to turn to each other. We didn't come up with an Ebola vaccine. We came up with a way to embrace. This is a picture of Christo Brand, Nelson Mandela's prison guard. At 18, he was an advocate of apartheid, but he was also Mandela's jailer. And they formed a friendship. A friendship started because Mandela offered him legal advice on how to deal with the loss of property from his family. And over time, that friendship led to Brand bringing messages to Mandela and bringing books and materials, and eventually even bringing his grandson to Mandela while he was in prison. Friendship, even in the context of prison, divided by apartheid and a system of apartheid which led them to believe that they were enemies, forged an alliance which contributed to not only the release of Mandela, but the change in South Africa. But these examples of community extend not only to other parts of the world, but right here. This is a school right here in Bedford-Stuyvesant, PS 28, Public School 28. A school where over 30% of the children are homeless. A school that thrives because of community. because the school is a place where parents can get job training, when teachers' education, where teachers are taught how to respond to the social and emotional needs of children, where children can get health care if they need it, including dental work. A school that functions as a community center and can counter the effects of poverty. And yet another school, Brockton High School in Massachusetts, the largest school in the state, 4,000 students, the only urban school in the state of Massachusetts that receives a level 1 rating by the state. And why? Because the teachers there decided that if they worked together, despite the policies of the state, to ensure that children learn to read and write, that they could serve and meet all their needs. For the last 4 years, over 1/3 of their students have received a scholarship to any public university they want to attend in Massachusetts. If you look at the picture, 1/3 of those students are African American, 1/3 Latino, 1/3 low-income white. There is a counter-narrative out there about the possibilities for acting on our common humanity, and it exists in many places, but not nearly known enough. Here's a school in the Bronx, the School for Language and Technology, a school that serves students who are recent immigrants to this country, mostly from the Dominican Republic, students who did not attend school regularly in their own country, who come to this country not literate in their native language, who within 5 years graduate, not only speaking English, but passing all 6 of their regents. When I met these students and I asked them, what is about this school that makes it so special? The students told me repeatedly, it feels like family. It's a place where we're safe, and where over 30% of the students are undocumented. It's a school that knows that though they cannot change the laws, they can still secure their futures. So these young people have opportunities to work and support themselves, even though the laws still make them fugitives. We have examples all around us that another way is possible. What Patch is about is trying to build on those possibilities in a very deliberate way. Building on them through cultivating agency at multiple levels. Agency is much more than grit. We hear a lot about the importance of hard work. Agency is about collective action, is about working together to solve common problems in our common interest. It's about tapping into our creativity so that we can imagine new possibilities and new ways of doing things, rather than simply feeling overwhelmed and giving in to the pessimism. And it is about building community. You heard this repeatedly about the effects of isolation and the effects of our withdrawal and our alienation. The counter to that is building community across difference. Community so that together we can in fact solve the problems that face us. Patch is not going to change the world by itself, but the fact is that if we don't take collective and deliberate steps to create a new narrative, a new story, the story we're faced with is quite bleak. And so Patch is about changing the story and building on those efforts. Thank you.